10 thrilling true horror stories from Alaska region with rain sound for good night's sleep. Welcome back to Horror Vault Channel. Prepare to journey into the icy wilderness of Alaska, where beauty meets bone-chilling terror. In this video, I will tell you 10 true horror stories from the Alaska region, which will include the last frontier. Tales of eerie encounters, mysterious disappearances, and the lurking unknown. Let the soothing sound of rain accompany you as these haunting tales unfold, blurring the line between sleep and suspense. If you like these stories, then I recommend you to subscribe to our channel to keep watching our upcoming unique true horror stories from different parts of our world. So, without delay, let's deep dive into these stories. Story 1. The Whispers in the Cave. My name is Michael Carter, and I've always been drawn to the wilderness. The Chugach Mountains of Alaska had been on my list for years, untamed, remote, and breathtakingly beautiful. So when my friends Julie, Rob, Sarah, and I decided to embark on a 3-day hiking expedition into an uncharted part of the range, I was thrilled. We were all seasoned hikers, and this was supposed to be an adventure we'd talk about for years. The first day was idyllic. The crisp mountain air filled our lungs as we trekked through dense forests and climbed rocky paths. We camped by a stream that night under a canopy of stars, laughing and sharing stories around the fire. It felt like nothing could go wrong. But everything changed on the second day. We were making our way up a steep incline when Julie, who was ahead of us as usual, called out, "Guys, you've got to see this." Her voice was tinged with excitement. We hurried to where she stood, staring at what appeared to be the entrance to a cave. It was partially hidden behind a cluster of bushes and framed by a strange stone archway that looked almost man-made. Moss clung to the stones, but they didn't seem as ancient as you'd expect in such an isolated place. "This isn't on any map," I said, running my hand over the smooth surface of the stones. "What do you think it is? Maybe some kind of old shelter?" Sarah suggested, though her voice betrayed her unease. Rob shrugged. "It could be anything, but we should check it out. Who knows what's inside?" Julie was already crouching to enter the narrow opening before anyone could protest. "Come on! It's huge in here," she called back. Reluctantly, we followed her inside. The cave opened into a massive chamber with walls that shimmered faintly in the light of our flashlights. It was stunning, almost otherworldly. The air was cool and carried a faint metallic scent. As we ventured deeper, we noticed strange carvings on the walls. Spirals, jagged lines, and symbols none of us recognized. "What do you think these mean?" Julie asked, snapping photos with her camera. "Probably some kind of indigenous markings," Sarah said, though she sounded unsure. Then we found it. A circle of stones arranged carefully on the ground with charred remains at its center. It looked like an old fire pit, but the stones were etched with the same strange symbols as the walls. "This is weird," Rob muttered, kneeling to examine one of the stones more closely. "We shouldn't be here," Sarah said suddenly. She had been quiet since we entered the cave, but now looked visibly shaken. "Something about this place feels wrong." Before anyone could respond, Julie pointed her flashlight toward another part of the chamber where a dark pit yawned in the floor, a perfect circle descending into blackness. "Whoa," she whispered. "How deep do you think that goes?" "Let's not find out," I said quickly, but Julie was already leaning over it. "Do you hear that?" she asked. We all froze and listened. At first, there was only silence, but then I heard it too, a faint murmur rising from the depths of the pit. It wasn't wind or water. It sounded like voices whispering just out of reach. "It's probably just an echo," Rob said nervously. Julie picked up a small rock and dropped it into the pit. We waited for the sound of it hitting bottom, but it never came. The whispers grew louder. "Okay, that's enough," I said firmly. "Let's get out of here." As we turned to leave, our flashlights began to flicker one by one until we were plunged into darkness. Panic set in as we fumbled to turn them back on, but when they finally worked again, something had changed. The carvings on the walls seemed to shift under the light. their shapes twisting into grotesque forms that hadn't been there before. And then there were footsteps, soft but deliberate, echoing from deeper within the cave. "Run!" I shouted. We bolted for the entrance, tripping over rocks and each other in our desperation to escape. When we finally burst out into daylight, gasping for air, none of us spoke for several minutes. "We're not camping here tonight," Rob finally said, his face pale. We agreed and hiked several miles away before setting up camp again, but none of us slept well that night. The whispers seemed to follow us in our dreams. The next morning brought no relief. When we returned to where we had left our backpacks during our initial exploration of the cave, they had been rifled through, and around them were more of those strange symbols etched into the dirt. "This isn't possible," Sarah whispered, clutching her arms tightly around herself. We decided to cut our trip short and head back toward civilization. But no matter which path we took, it felt like we were walking in circles. The landscape seemed to shift around us as if guiding us back toward that cursed cave. By nightfall, we were completely lost, and that's when Sarah disappeared. One moment she was walking just ahead of me. The next, she was gone without a sound. We searched frantically for hours but found no trace of her, not even footprints leading away from where she had been standing. That night was pure terror. The whispers returned louder than ever before, this time accompanied by shadows moving just beyond our firelight. None of us dared leave the circle of flames until dawn finally broke over the mountains. When morning came, so did despair. Rob was gone too. Julie and I barely spoke as we stumbled through the wilderness in search of help. But deep down I think we both knew there would be no escape from whatever had claimed our friends. Eventually, mercifully, we found a ranger station at the edge of the park where they radioed for help. But even now, as I sit here, writing this account weeks later safe at home, I can still hear those whispers whenever everything goes quiet around me. And sometimes, late at night, I see shadows dancing at the edges of my vision. Shadows shaped like things that should not exist in this world or any other. Now we move towards the next story. Story 2. The Stranger by the River. I was 12 years old, and it was Father's Day, a perfect Alaskan summer day, where the sun never truly sets and the sky stays a soft blue even at midnight. My family and I had driven south to the Russian River for a week-long camping and fishing trip. The river, surrounded by lush green forests and towering mountains, was breathtaking, a slice of untouched wilderness that felt like it belonged in another world. It was my favorite place to be. We set up camp on a hill overlooking the river. From there, a narrow trail zigzagged down through dense forest to the water. The riverbank was alive with activity. Fishermen shoulder to shoulder, casting their lines into the rushing water, hoping to snag a salmon. It was chaotic but exhilarating, a strange mix of camaraderie and competition. By evening, most of the fishermen had packed up and left. My family decided to call it a day too, but I wasn't ready to give up. It was Father's Day, and I was determined to catch a fish for my dad. He laughed and told me not to stay out too late, but I could see he appreciated my effort. As the hours passed, the river grew quieter. The chatter of fishermen faded until it was just me and the sound of rushing water. The sun dipped lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the riverbank. I didn't mind being alone. I'd grown up in Alaska's wilderness and felt at home here. But as I looked around, I realized how far I'd wandered from the others. The nearest person was nowhere in sight. That's when I heard it. A faint rustling from across the river. I froze, my heart skipping a beat. In Alaska, rustling in the bushes usually meant one thing: bears. I scanned the opposite bank nervously, expecting to see a grizzly emerge from the trees. Instead, I saw something that made my blood run cold. A man. He was crouched low in the bushes, partially hidden by the foliage. At first, I thought he might be another fisherman who'd wandered off trail, but something about him didn't feel right. His movements were too deliberate, too predatory, like he was trying not to be seen. Then he stood up. He was pale and heavy-set, with curly blonde hair that stuck out from under a bright pink hoodie. A strange choice for someone lurking in the woods. He stared at me across the river with an intensity that made my skin crawl. "Hey there," he called out, his voice rough and uneven. I hesitated before responding. Hi. "You got a net," he said, pointing at the fishing net in my hand. "Mind if I borrow it? My rod's no good. It's, my dad's," I stammered. He smiled, a thin, unsettling smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Where's your dad? You shouldn't be out here alone." I swallowed hard, gripping my net tighter. "He's back at camp." "Well," he said, stepping closer to the water's edge. "Why don't you come over here? I know a secret spot where you can catch all the fish you want." My instincts screamed at me to run, but my legs felt rooted to the ground. "No thanks," I managed to say. "Come on," he urged, his tone growing sharper. "It's just over there." He gestured toward the dense forest behind him. I shook my head and took a step back toward the trail. His smile vanished. "Meet me at the bridge," he said flatly before disappearing into the trees. My heart pounded as I turned and hurried upstream toward where I knew there were other people. But when I glanced back over my shoulder, my stomach dropped. The man had reappeared on my side of the river and was following me. I tried to stay calm as I quickened my pace, scanning for anyone who might still be fishing nearby. Finally, I spotted a couple setting up their gear further upstream and made a beeline for them. For a while, I stayed close to them, pretending to fish while keeping an eye on the man lurking in the distance. He paced back and forth along the riverbank, like an animal stalking its prey. Every so often, he would glance in my direction before disappearing into the trees again. The couple eventually packed up and left, leaving me alone once more. I should have gone back to camp then. I know that now, but stubbornness got the better of me. I wasn't going to let some creepy stranger ruin my Father's Day surprise. Big mistake. It wasn't long before he returned, this time charging straight toward me through the shallow water with alarming speed. "Hey!" he shouted angrily as he grabbed my arm with one hand and yanked me toward him by my shirt collar with the other. "I told you to meet me at the bridge." His grip was like iron, painful and unrelenting, and his breath reeked of alcohol as he leaned in close. "Let go!" I shouted, finally finding my voice as panic overtook me. But he didn't let go, instead dragging me toward his side of the river with terrifying strength, while muttering something about the secret spot. My mind raced as I struggled against him, kicking, twisting, doing everything I could think of to break free, but it was no use. He was too strong. Just when all hope seemed lost, a voice rang out from behind us. "Bear." The man froze mid-step as several people came crashing through the trees onto our side of the riverbank, my mom among them, waving their arms and shouting loudly enough to scare off any wildlife or deranged strangers. Startled by their sudden appearance, and possibly mistaking their shouts for warnings about an actual bear, he released me abruptly before bolting back across the river into the woods without another word or backward glance. Shaking uncontrollably but relieved beyond measure, I stumbled toward my mom as she enveloped me in her arms while others called out after him futilely into fading daylight. Now we move towards the next story. Story 3. The Cabin in the Storm. My name is Javier, and I've spent most of my life exploring the rugged beauty of the Sierra Gorda Mountains in Querétaro. As a guide and outdoor enthusiast, I've always found solace in the wilderness, a place where the noise of the world fades away, leaving only the whispers of nature. But there's a part of me that will never return to those mountains. Not after what happened that night. It was late October, just before the season turned bitterly cold. I had set out alone to chart a new trail for my guidebooks, eager to explore a less traveled section of the Sierra. The day started off perfectly. Clear skies, crisp air, and the steady rhythm of my boots crunching against the dirt path. I felt alive, surrounded by towering trees and the occasional rustle of wildlife. By mid-afternoon, though, the weather shifted. Dark clouds rolled in faster than I'd ever seen, swallowing the sun in minutes. The wind picked up, sharp and biting, carrying with it the unmistakable scent of rain. I debated turning back, but convinced myself to push on just a little farther, to reach a ridge I'd been aiming for all morning. That was my first mistake. The rain began as a drizzle, but quickly turned into a downpour. The trail became a slick mess of mud and tangled roots, and visibility dropped to almost nothing as fog crept in around me. My map was useless now, smudged and unreadable from the rain, and every direction looked the same. Trees loomed like silent sentinels, their branches clawing at the gray sky. I was lost. Panic started to creep in as nightfall approached. My flashlight barely cut through the thick mist, and every step felt like it carried me deeper into an endless maze. That's when I saw it, a structure barely visible through the trees. At first, I thought it was a trick of my tired eyes, or maybe just an old hunting blind. But as I got closer, I realized it was a small cabin, its weathered stone walls blending almost seamlessly with the forest around it. Relief washed over me. Shelter meant safety, at least for the night. The cabin was ancient. Its wooden door hung crookedly on rusted hinges, and moss clung to its stone foundation like a second skin. Still, it was dry inside, and that was enough for me. The interior was sparse. A broken table leaned against one wall, a few rotting chairs scattered about, and an old fireplace filled with ash long gone cold. I dropped my pack in a corner and sat down to catch my breath. The storm raged outside, wind howling like some wild animal trying to claw its way in. But inside, there was an eerie stillness, a silence so heavy it felt unnatural. That's when I noticed a backpack. It sat near the fireplace, covered in dust but otherwise intact. It looked as though someone had left it there years ago and never returned for it. Curiosity got the better of me. I unzipped it carefully and found a few items: a rusted flashlight, an empty water bottle, and a small notebook with yellowed pages. The writing inside was erratic, scrawled lines that grew more frantic with each page. Lost. Can't find my way back. Something is out there. It watches from the trees. Waiting. The last entry sent chills down my spine. It's here. I snapped the notebook shut and tossed it aside, trying to shake off the unease creeping up my neck. It was probably just someone who had gotten lost like me, a hiker who'd panicked and let their imagination run wild. That's what I told myself anyway. And then I heard it. Footsteps outside. They were slow and deliberate, crunching against wet leaves just beyond the cabin walls. My heart pounded as I grabbed my flashlight and pointed it toward the door. Hello. My voice sounded small against the storm's roar. No answer. The footsteps stopped directly outside the door. I held my breath, straining to hear anything over the wind and rain. Then came another sound, a low, scraping noise like nails dragging across wood. It moved along the doorframe slowly, deliberately, before stopping completely. I waited for what felt like hours before mustering up enough courage to peek out through one of the broken windows. The forest beyond was dark and impenetrable. Whatever had been there was gone or hiding. I bolted the door as best as I could with some old planks I found lying around and retreated to a corner farthest from it. Sleep was impossible. Every creak of wood or gust of wind made me jump. And then came another sound, this time from inside. Footsteps again. But now they were coming from above me. My blood ran cold as I realized there must be an attic or crawl space above the cabin that I hadn't noticed before. The footsteps were faint but unmistakable, slow and heavy like something pacing back and forth directly overhead. I shone my flashlight at the ceiling, but saw nothing unusual, just warped wooden beams stained dark with age. Who's there? I shouted, my voice cracking under fear. No response, just more pacing. I don't know how long this went on, minutes, hours. Time seemed meaningless in that suffocating darkness, but eventually, everything went silent again, too silent, and then came 3 loud knocks on the door. I froze as dread washed over me in waves. Whoever or whatever it was didn't try to force its way in. It just knocked again, 3 times, slow and deliberate. I didn't answer. I couldn't even move, but somehow I knew that opening that door would be worse than staying inside with whatever might be lurking above me. When dawn finally broke through the storm clouds hours later, I wasted no time grabbing my pack and bolting out of that cursed cabin without looking back once. Not even when I thought I heard faint laughter echoing through the trees behind me. It took me most of that day to find my way back to civilization, a small village where locals listened quietly as I recounted what had happened. When I described finding the cabin deep in the forest, their faces darkened. "There's no cabin out there," one old man said gravely. "Not anymore." "What do you mean?" I asked hesitantly. "It burned down decades ago," he replied. "No one goes near those woods anymore. Not since people started disappearing. To this day, I don't know what I encountered in that storm or how that cabin could have existed if what they said was true. All I know is this: something waits out there in those mountains, something patient, something hungry. And if you ever find yourself lost in its domain, don't open the door." And now the new story for you. Story 4, The Uninvited. I was 14 when it happened, and even now, at 34, the memory still grips me like a cold hand on the back of my neck. It was summer in Alaska, and the sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across our quiet house on the edge of the forest. The kind of place where silence was a constant companion, until it wasn't. Our house was 2 stories, with a rec room downstairs where my brother Travis and I often spent our evenings. Travis was 2 years older than me and had Down syndrome. He loved his routines, his music, his movies. I loved the peace of our home, the feeling of safety that came with knowing everyone in our small town. But that summer shattered all illusions of safety. It started with Brewster, our dog. He was a big Labrador-Weimaraner mix, a gentle giant who only barked when there was a reason. That summer, though, he barked every night like clockwork, sharp, urgent barks that echoed through the stillness. My parents dismissed it as bears or wolves passing through the yard, but I knew Brewster's bark. This wasn't about animals. One Wednesday evening, my parents left for their weekly church service, leaving me to watch over Travis. It wasn't unusual. I'd been babysitting since I was 11, well trained in first aid and responsibility. The house felt quiet without them. Just the hum of the television downstairs and Brewster's occasional grumble from his pen outside. Around 8 p.m., I heard it, the unmistakable creak of the front door opening downstairs. At first, I thought it was my parents returning early, but then I realized something was off. There had been no sound of their car pulling into the driveway, no familiar voices calling out as they came in. My stomach tightened as I crept to the top of the stairs and peered down. I froze. A man stood at the bottom of the staircase. He wore heavy work boots and faded jeans, his figure half hidden by shadows. He didn't belong here. That much I knew instantly. My heart pounded as I backed away from the stairs, grabbing Travis by the arm and dragging him to my parents' bedroom. He protested softly, confused by my urgency, but I managed to get him inside and lock the door behind us. "Stay here," I whispered to him as calmly as I could. "Don't make any noise." I grabbed my dad's rifle from its spot in the closet. It felt heavy and unfamiliar in my hands, and picked up the phone to call our neighbor. My voice shook as I whispered into the receiver. "There's someone in my house." She didn't hesitate. "Stay put," she said firmly. "I'm coming over." Minutes felt like hours as we waited in silence. Every creak of the floorboards downstairs made my heart race faster. Travis sat quietly on the bed, his wide eyes watching me for reassurance I couldn't give him. Then came footsteps, slow and deliberate, ascending the stairs. I held my breath as they stopped outside my parents' bedroom door. The handle rattled once, twice, then fell silent again. A moment later, there was a loud bang from outside, A door slamming open, and Brewster's furious barking filled the air. Our neighbor had arrived with her dog and scared off whoever had been inside. When she found us upstairs, she told me she'd seen someone running into the woods behind our house, but hadn't been able to catch them. For weeks after that night, Brewster's barking continued every evening without fail. We never saw anyone again, at least not until much later, but we knew someone was out there. Then came the fire. It happened late one night, while we were all asleep. I woke to the smell of smoke and Brewster's frantic barking outside my window. Flames licked up through the floorboards of Travis's room across from mine as I screamed for everyone to wake up. We barely made it out alive. The fire destroyed most of our home before firefighters managed to put it out. When they investigated its cause, they found something chilling. Matches scattered near the crawl space under our house. The same crawl space where someone had been living for months without our knowledge. Inside that crawl space were cigarette butts, soda cans, and other signs of habitation, and holes drilled into the plywood walls that lined up perfectly with spots where we often changed clothes or hung out during sleepovers in the rec room downstairs. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. Whoever had been living there had been watching us, watching me, for weeks or even months. The police suspected Mark, a troubled teenager who'd visited our house once before under the guise of being friends with Travis. My mom had always felt uneasy around him. Now she knew why. But nothing ever came of it legally. There wasn't enough evidence to press charges against him or anyone else. We rebuilt our home over several months, but things were never quite the same after that summer. The sense of security we'd once taken for granted was gone forever. Even now, decades later, I can't shake certain habits born from those events. Locking every door and window obsessively, checking every corner of every room before going to bed, sleeping with lights on if I'm alone in my house. And sometimes, late at night when everything is quiet, I think about those holes drilled into plywood walls and wonder how many secrets they still hold within their silent wood-grain whispers from long ago. And now the next true horror story from the Alaska. Story 5. The Shadows Beneath the Ranch. My name is Alejandro Vargas, and when the pandemic struck in 2020, I thought I'd found the perfect escape. The chaos of the city, empty shelves, masked faces, and the constant hum of fear was suffocating. My grandfather's old ranch in the mountains of Oaxaca seemed like a sanctuary. I hadn't visited it since I was a boy, but I remembered it as a peaceful place. Rolling hills, thick forests, and silence broken only by the occasional howl of a distant coyote. The ranch was in disrepair when I arrived. The main house stood like a crumbling monument to my family's past. The windows were shattered, the roof sagged in places, and vines had claimed most of the exterior walls. Still, it was isolated and quiet, exactly what I needed. The first few days passed uneventfully. I spent my time cleaning up the house and exploring the surrounding land. It felt good to be away from the world's madness. But on my second evening there, I stumbled upon something strange. Near the edge of the property, hidden beneath overgrown bushes and brambles, was a large metal door embedded in the ground. It looked ancient, rusted and weathered by time, but solid. A faint memory stirred in my mind. As a child, I had once asked my grandfather about this area of the ranch. He had brushed off my curiosity with a vague warning. Some doors are better left closed. But now, standing before it as an adult, curiosity got the better of me. It took hours to clear away the brush and debris covering the door. When I finally pried it open with a crowbar, a rush of stale air greeted me, a mix of damp earth and something metallic. My flashlight revealed a narrow staircase leading down into darkness. I hesitated for a moment before descending. The stairs ended in a small underground chamber. The walls were rough stone, and the floor was littered with old furniture. Broken chairs, rusted tools, and wooden crates stacked haphazardly. In the center of the room stood a table covered in papers and photographs. My flashlight beam danced across faded images of people I didn't recognize. stern faces staring blankly at the camera, and notes scribbled in handwriting that was barely legible. One photo caught my eye. It showed 7 people standing near what looked like this very door. Behind them, barely visible in the shadows, was something else, a figure that didn't belong. It was small and misshapen, its outline blurred as if it had been caught mid-motion. A chill ran down my spine. I tried to shake off my unease as I sifted through more papers. Most were incomprehensible, filled with strange symbols and diagrams that made no sense to me. But one phrase scrawled repeatedly across several pages stood out. No abrir la puerta. Do not open the door. I left the chamber quickly after that. Over the next few days, strange things began happening around the ranch. At night, I heard faint footsteps outside my window. Too light to be human, but too deliberate to be an animal. During the day, objects seemed to move on their own. Tools I'd left in one spot would appear somewhere else entirely. Doors I'd closed would be open when I returned. And then there were the whispers. They started softly, barely audible murmurs that seemed to come from nowhere, and grew louder each night until they became impossible to ignore. They spoke in a language I couldn't understand, but filled me with an overwhelming sense of dread. On my 4th night at the ranch, I woke to find muddy footprints leading from the metal door to my bedroom window. They weren't human, long-toed and clawed, but they stopped abruptly outside as if whatever had made them had simply vanished into thin air. That was when I decided to go back down into the chamber. This time, I noticed something new. Another door at the far end of the room that I hadn't seen before. It was smaller than the first, but made of thick steel reinforced with chains and locks. The air around it felt heavy, oppressive, and carried that same metallic scent from before, but stronger now. As I approached it, my flashlight flickered and died. In complete darkness, I heard movement behind me, a soft shuffling sound like bare feet on stone, and froze. My breath caught in my throat as something cold brushed against my arm. I ran blindly up the stairs and slammed the metal door shut behind me. That night was hellish. The whispers grew louder than ever before, angry now, and seemed to come from all directions at once. Shadows danced across my walls, even though there was no light source to cast them. And then came the knocking, slow, deliberate thuds against my bedroom door that continued until dawn. By morning, I knew I couldn't stay any longer. I packed what little I could carry and left without looking back. As I drove away from the ranch, exhaustion overcame me, and for just a moment, I glanced in my rearview mirror. Standing at the edge of the property near that cursed metal door was a figure, not human but not entirely alien either, with eyes that glowed faintly in broad daylight. Even now, months later, those eyes haunt me every time I close mine to sleep. I've tried researching what might have been beneath that ranch, local legends or historical records, but found nothing concrete. All I know is this: some doors are meant to stay closed because once you open them, you might not be able to shut them again. And some things, once released, will follow you forever. That's the end of story number 5. And now the next. Story 6. The Man Named Dave. I was 23 when my best friend Eric and I decided to take an impulsive trip to Alaska. We were young, broke, and full of that restless energy that makes you believe the world is yours to conquer. Neither of us had ever been to Alaska before, but we'd heard stories about its rugged beauty, its untamed wilderness, and the promise of adventure. It seemed like the perfect place for 2 aimless Brits looking for something extraordinary. We didn't plan much. Actually, we didn't plan at all. We figured we'd hitchhike our way through the state, stay in cheap motels or hostels, and soak in as much of the Alaskan experience as possible. It was the late 1970s, and hitchhiking didn't carry the same stigma it does now. Back then, it was just a way to get around when you couldn't afford a car. The first few days were uneventful. We caught rides with friendly locals who told us about their lives in this wild frontier. We marveled at the endless forests, towering mountains, and vast stretches of nothingness that made up the Alaskan landscape. But as we ventured deeper into the wilderness, rides became harder to come by. Towns grew smaller and farther apart, and the people we encountered seemed more wary of strangers. It was on one such day, stranded on a lonely stretch of highway with no cars in sight, that we met Dave. He pulled up in a massive truck with a hydraulic lift attached to the back. The kind of vehicle you'd expect someone working for a utility company to drive. He rolled down his window and grinned at us, a wide, toothy grin that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Need a lift?" he asked. Eric and I exchanged a glance. Something about him felt off, but we were desperate, and the thought of spending another night sleeping on the side of the road wasn't appealing. "Yeah," Eric said hesitantly. "Thanks." We climbed into the truck's cab, squeezing into the seat beside him. The interior smelled faintly of oil and cigarettes. Dave was a heavy-set man with curly blonde hair and pale skin that looked almost translucent under the harsh sunlight. He wore a faded plaid shirt and jeans that were stained with grease. "Where you boys headed?" he asked as he pulled back onto the highway. "Anywhere there's a motel," I said. Dave chuckled, a low, guttural sound that made my skin crawl. "Not many motels out here," he said, "but I know a place." For the next hour or so, Dave regaled us with stories about his life in Alaska. He claimed to work for a cable company, though he never mentioned which one, and talked about how much he loved living in such an isolated place. But there was something unsettling about him. His laughter came too easily, like he was constantly amused by some private joke we weren't in on. And his eyes, they never stayed on the road for long. Instead, they darted between Eric and me like he was sizing us up. We stopped at a bar in a tiny town whose name I can't remember. Dave insisted on buying us drinks. "You're my guest," he said, and we reluctantly agreed. The place was dimly lit and reeked of stale beer and sweat. Dave seemed to know everyone there, greeting them with that same toothy grin that never quite reached his eyes. After 2 more bars and several rounds of drinks later, Eric and I were starting to feel uneasy. Dave had grown increasingly erratic. One moment laughing uproariously at something neither of us found funny, the next falling into an eerie silence that made my stomach churn. At some point during the night, Eric leaned over to me and whispered, "We need to get out of here." I nodded. Something about Dave's demeanor had shifted, his jokes darker, his gaze lingering too long on us when he thought we weren't looking. But before we could make our excuses and leave, Dave disappeared. We searched for him inside the bar, but found no trace of him or his truck. "He wouldn't just leave us here," Eric said nervously. "Wouldn't he?" I replied. "Our backpacks, containing all our belongings, were still in his truck. Our passports, our money, everything we needed to survive this trip was gone." Panic set in as we realized how dire our situation was. Stranded in an unfamiliar town with no way to contact anyone for help. We spent hours wandering around aimlessly before finally stumbling upon a police station. When we explained what had happened to the officer on duty, a grizzled man who looked like he'd seen it all, he frowned deeply. "You said his name was Dave?" he asked. We nodded. The officer shook his head slowly. "No one around here by that name works for any cable company." "What do you mean?" Eric asked. "I mean whoever this Dave is," the officer replied grimly. "He's not who he says he is. They put out an alert for Dave's truck, but found nothing. It was as if he and our belongings had vanished into thin air. Months later, back home in England, I received an unexpected call from someone at the U.S. Embassy who had helped us replace our stolen passports after returning from Alaska. "You're not going to believe this," they said. Apparently, our backpacks had been returned anonymously to a sheriff's department near where we'd last seen Dave's truck. Everything inside them was intact. Our clothes, our money, even our passports. To this day, I don't know what Dave wanted or why he took our things only to return them later without explanation. Maybe it was some twisted game he liked playing with unsuspecting travelers like us. Or maybe we were just lucky enough not to find out what might have happened if we'd stayed with him any longer. Whatever his reasons were, I'll never forget that toothy grin that didn't quite reach his eyes, or how close we came to becoming just another story lost in Alaska's vast wilderness. That's the end of Story 6, and we now begin the next story. Story 7. The Island That Shouldn't Exist. My name is Daniel Reyes, and I've spent most of my life on the water. Fishing has been both my livelihood and my solace, a way to escape the noise of the world. But after what happened last September, I can't look at the sea the same way. I've come to fear its vastness, its silence, and most of all, what lies hidden beneath its surface. It began like any other fishing trip. The Gulf of Alaska was calm that morning, the water a sheet of silver under a gray sky. I had set out early from Seward on my old boat, Aurora, hoping to catch enough halibut and cod to justify the trip before the weather turned. The forecast had been clear, but anyone who spent time in these waters knows how quickly that can change. By midday, I felt it, the shift in the air. The wind picked up, sharp and cold, carrying with it the scent of rain. The water grew restless, small waves slapping against the hull. I decided to pull in my nets and head back before things got worse. But as I worked to haul in my catch, the sea turned violent. The storm came out of nowhere, a sudden fury of wind and waves that tossed Aurora like a toy. I fought to keep her steady, but a rogue wave hit us broadside with such force that I was thrown across the deck. When I scrambled to my feet, I realized with growing dread that the engine had stalled. Another wave crashed over us, and before I could react, Aurora struck something, a submerged rock or maybe a reef, and began to break apart. I don't remember much about how I ended up in the water. One moment, I was clinging to the wheel. The next, I was adrift in the freezing sea, clutching a piece of debris as my boat sank into the abyss. The storm raged on around me, and for what felt like hours, I drifted helplessly. Then I saw it, a dark shape on the horizon, an island. It shouldn't have been there. I knew these waters well, but there it was, jagged cliffs rising out of the sea like black teeth. Desperation drove me toward it. The waves carried me closer until I felt sand beneath my feet and collapsed onto the shore, shivering and gasping for breath. When I finally looked around, I realized how strange this place was. The island was small and ringed by cliffs that loomed over a dense forest of twisted trees. Everything was eerily quiet. No bird song, no rustle of leaves in the wind, just an oppressive stillness that made my skin crawl. I spent the first day exploring cautiously, searching for fresh water and shelter while trying to ignore the growing unease gnawing at me. Near sunset, I found what looked like an old campsite, a fire pit surrounded by stones and some rusted tools scattered nearby. It seemed abandoned for years, decades even, but there were fresh footprints leading away from it into the forest. I wasn't alone. That night was hellish. As darkness fell over the island, so did an unnatural silence. Even the sound of waves seemed muted. Lying under a makeshift shelter near the beach, I tried to sleep but kept waking to faint noises. Soft footsteps on sand, whispers carried by the wind. Each time I looked out into the night, there was nothing there, just shadows shifting among the trees. The next morning brought no relief. While searching for food along the shoreline, I found something that made my blood run cold. Symbols etched into rocks near where I had landed, crude shapes arranged in patterns that seemed deliberate but incomprehensible. Nearby were more footprints leading into the forest. Against my better judgment, I followed them. The trail led me deeper into the woods until I came upon a clearing dominated by an ancient stone altar covered in moss and more symbols carved into its surface. Around it lay remnants of offerings, bones bleached white by time, and small objects that looked like trinkets or idols made from wood and stone. As I stood there staring at this strange tableau, I felt it again, that oppressive stillness pressing down on me like a weight. Then came another sound. Movement behind me, a branch snapping underfoot. I spun around but saw nothing at first. Then it emerged from between two trees. A figure humanoid in shape but wrong somehow. Its limbs too long. Its movements too fluid, as if it were gliding rather than walking. Its face, or what should have been its face, was featureless save for two deep voids where eyes might have been. I ran. Branches tore at my clothes as I fled blindly through the forest back toward the beach. When I finally broke through to open ground, gasping for air and heart pounding like a drumbeat in my chest, there was no sign of pursuit. But neither did I feel safe. Over the next 2 days, trapped on that cursed island, things only got worse. My supplies dwindled, while strange events escalated. Objects moved when I wasn't looking. Whispers grew louder at night. Shadows danced at edges just beyond reach of firelight. On my third night there, the night before rescue came, I woke abruptly to find myself not alone in my shelter, but paralyzed with fear as it crouched just outside staring at me with those empty voids where eyes should be. It didn't move closer. It didn't need to. But somehow its presence invaded every corner of my mind until all thought dissolved into pure terror. When dawn broke again, if you could call it dawn under such an oppressive sky, salvation arrived unexpectedly. A passing fishing vessel spotted me waving frantically from shore. I never spoke about what happened on that island. Not fully. Not even when doctors asked why someone with no history of mental illness would wake screaming every night for months afterward or refuse ever again to set foot near open water. But now you know why some places are better left undiscovered, and why some islands aren't meant to exist at all. That's the NFO Story 7. And here's the next horror tale from the Alaska. Story 8, The Yukon Pursuit. It was the summer of 2012, a time when life felt full of promise and adventure. My mother and I were on a road trip, driving through the vast wilderness of Canada's Yukon Territory. We were heading home to Alaska after I had decided to leave my university in Montana due to financial struggles. The plan was simple. Drive during daylight hours, enjoy the scenery, and make it to our next stop before nightfall. But as the third day of our journey unfolded, I learned how quickly plans could unravel, and how terrifying the unknown could be. The day had started off uneventfully. We'd stopped in a few small towns for snacks and gas, marveling at the beauty of the endless forests and mountains surrounding us. By late afternoon, we were back on the road, heading toward Dawson City. The sun dipped lower in the sky, painting everything in hues of gold and crimson. It was beautiful but fleeting. Darkness was falling faster than I anticipated. My mother couldn't drive at night due to her poor vision following eye surgery, so I took over as dusk settled in. The highway stretched out like a ribbon through the wilderness, with no streetlights or signs of civilization for miles. The only sound was the hum of our car's engine and the occasional rustle of trees swaying in the wind. Then it happened. I noticed headlights behind us, a vehicle approaching fast. At first, I thought nothing of it. It was rare to see another car on these remote roads, but not impossible. However, as the vehicle drew closer, something felt off. Its high beams were glaringly bright, making it hard for me to see through my rearview mirror. I slowed down slightly, hoping they would pass me. They didn't. Instead, they matched my speed, staying uncomfortably close behind us. My stomach tightened as an icy wave of unease washed over me. "Why aren't they passing?" my mother asked nervously from the passenger seat. "I don't know," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. Maybe they're just being cautious. But deep down, I didn't believe that. Something about their behavior felt deliberate, menacing even. I decided to pull over onto the shoulder and let them pass. Surely they'd go around us if I made it clear I wasn't in their way. But as soon as I slowed down and moved aside, they did too. They stayed right behind us, mimicking my every move. My mother's panic began to rise. What are they doing? Why are they following us? "I don't know," I said again, though this time my voice betrayed my fear. I tried speeding up, 10 kilometers over the limit, then 20, but they stayed glued to our bumper. Their high beams continued to blind me in my mirrors, making it nearly impossible to focus on the road ahead. "Maybe it's just some idiot playing games," I said aloud, more to convince myself than her. But then things escalated. The car behind us suddenly roared forward and swerved into our lane, as if trying to ram us off the road. My hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly that my knuckles turned white. Adrenaline surged through me as I veered back onto the main road, just in time to avoid them hitting us. "Call 911. I shouted at my mom. She fumbled with her phone but quickly realized there was no signal. Not surprising given how remote we were. A sinking feeling settled in my chest as I realized we were completely alone out here with whoever was in that car. For several agonizing minutes, they continued their game of cat and mouse, speeding up beside us only to slam on their brakes or swerve dangerously close to our car. My heart pounded so loudly that it drowned out everything else. The engine noise, my mother's panic breathing, all of it faded into background static as pure survival instinct took over. Finally, just as we neared a small town called Arlington, they made their boldest move yet, pulling ahead of us before slamming on their brakes diagonally across both lanes of traffic. Their vehicle, a large SUV, blocked our path completely. I barely managed to stop in time without skidding off into the ditch beside the road. My mother screamed beside me while I sat frozen behind the wheel, staring at the figures emerging from their car. There were two of them, men dressed in dark jackets with caps pulled low over their faces. They moved slowly toward us like predators closing in on prey. Something inside me snapped then, some primal instinct for self-preservation that overrode every ounce of fear weighing me down until that moment. "Hold on!" I yelled at my mom before throwing the car into reverse and slamming down on the gas pedal as hard as I could. The tires screeched against asphalt as we shot backward down the highway at breakneck speed. The men shouted something unintelligible behind us, but didn't follow right away, probably stunned by my sudden move. I didn't wait around for them to recover. Instead, I spun the car around in one fluid motion and floored it toward Arlington without looking back once. When we finally reached town, a cluster of dimly lit buildings nestled against towering evergreens, I pulled into the parking lot of a small motel and killed the engine. Both my mother and I sat there trembling for what felt like an eternity before she finally managed to get out and run inside for help. The local police arrived within half an hour, but found no trace of our pursuers when they searched nearby roads later that night. Whoever those men were, or whatever their intentions had been, they'd vanished in the thin air just as mysteriously as they'd appeared. To this day, I don't know who they were or why they targeted us that night on that lonely stretch of highway, but sometimes ignorance is bliss, because imagining what might have happened if things had gone differently is far more terrifying than not knowing at all. Now we will listen to the next true story from Alaska. Story 9, The Alaska Triangle, a horror beyond time. My name is Dr. Edward Jensen, and I've spent most of my career as a geophysicist chasing anomalies. Strange blips in the magnetic field, unexplained energy signatures, and occasional phenomena that defy logic. But nothing prepared me for what happened in the Alaska Triangle. It's been years since that expedition, but the memories still haunt me. I've tried to bury them under the weight of scientific reasoning, but something simply refused to stay buried. It started with a call from my supervisor at the Research Institute. "Edward," he said, "we've picked up something unusual near the Tanana River. Anomalous magnetic readings. We need you to lead a team into the field." I was skeptical at first. Anomalies are often just glitches in data or natural occurrences we don't yet fully understand. But this one was different. The readings were erratic, stronger than anything I'd seen before, and they seemed to shift as if alive. The team consisted of 4 people. Myself, Marta, an expert in electromagnetic systems. Wilson, a young technician with a penchant for conspiracy theories. And Jensen, a cartographer and survivalist. We were joined by Tomac, a local guide who knew the area like the back of his hand. We flew into Fairbanks and then took a hydroplane to a remote base camp near the Tanana River. From there, we would trek north toward the epicenter of the anomaly. The first day was uneventful. We calibrated our equipment, checked our maps, and listened to Tomac's stories around the campfire. "This place is strange," he said, his voice low and serious. The locals call it the triangle because people disappear here. Planes vanish. Hikers are never found, even time seems to bend. He chuckled nervously after saying this, but his eyes betrayed genuine fear. We set out early the next morning, carrying GPS devices, magnetometers, cameras, and enough supplies for a week. The forest was eerily quiet. No bird song, no rustling leaves, just an oppressive silence that seemed to swallow our footsteps. By midday, we reached the anomaly's epicenter, a clearing surrounded by towering black spruce trees. The moment we stepped into it, our instruments went haywire. The magnetometer showed wildly fluctuating readings. The compass needle spun erratically. "This shouldn't be possible," Marta muttered as she adjusted her equipment. Even our GPS devices began displaying nonsensical coordinates, places hundreds of miles away from where we stood. That night was when things began to unravel. We were reviewing data in our tents when we heard it, a low hum that seemed to emanate from everywhere and nowhere at once. It wasn't loud, but resonated deep in our chests like a vibration more than a sound. Then came the lights. Pale blue orbs floating between the trees, moving with an almost sentient grace. "What are those?" Wilson whispered, his voice trembling. "Ball lightning?" I suggested weakly, though I knew it wasn't true. Tomac stood abruptly. "Stay inside your tents," he said firmly before grabbing his rifle and stepping out into the darkness. We watched through small tent windows as he disappeared into the forest after one of the lights. He never came back. By morning, his tent was empty, his gear untouched as if he had simply vanished into thin air. We searched for hours but found no trace of him, not even footprints in the snow-covered ground. That night, the hum returned, louder this time, and with it came an unbearable pressure in the air that made it hard to breathe. The lights reappeared too, circling our camp like predators stalking prey. Marta tried to film them with her camera, but its battery drained instantly despite being fully charged moments earlier. On the fourth day, we decided to leave. The forest seemed alive now, trees shifting subtly when we weren't looking, paths looping back on themselves no matter which direction we took. Our compasses were useless. Even Jensen admitted he couldn't navigate us out. Then we found it. A rusted metal structure half buried in snow, a relic from decades past that looked like an old observation post or scientific station. Inside were yellowed papers covered in notes about magnetic anomalies eerily similar to what we'd been recording. "This can't be," Marta whispered as she flipped through them. "These are from 1968. They describe exactly what we're experiencing." Before we could process this revelation fully, Wilson screamed from outside. We rushed out but found only his flashlight lying in the snow, its beam flickering weakly before going out entirely. Now it was just Marta, Jensen, and me left. We huddled inside the metal structure that night as the hum grew deafening and shadows danced outside. Shadows that didn't belong to any light source we could see. Then came the voices, faint at first but growing louder until they were unmistakable. Our own voices echoing back at us from somewhere deep within the forest. "Edward, help us!" It was Wilson's voice, or something mimicking him perfectly. I don't remember how we escaped, or if we truly did. My last memory is of a blinding flash of light and Marta screaming my name before everything went black. When I woke up, I was alone back at our original base camp near Fairbanks. My watch was broken, its hands frozen at 3:17 a.m., the exact time I'd last checked it before entering that cursed clearing days earlier. No one believed my story. Not about Tomac's disappearance or Wilson's screams, or even Marta's final cry echoing in my ears long after I'd left Alaska behind me physically, if not mentally. Years later, now living far away from those frozen woods, I still hear that hum sometimes late at night when everything else is silent, and wonder if whatever lives within Alaska's triangle ever truly let me go. And that's the end of story number 9. And here is the final true horror story for you. Story 10, The Crawl Space. I grew up on an island in Alaska, a place where the wilderness pressed against every corner of life. Our house was perched on the edge of a forest, 2 stories tall with a crawl space beneath it. It wasn't a big house, but it was ours, built by my father's hands, filled with the warmth of family and the occasional bark of our dog, Brewster. Life was simple and quiet in our little corner of the world. But that peace shattered one summer when I was 11 years old, a summer I'll never forget. The crawl space beneath our house was a strange, dark place. It housed 2 massive water tanks for collecting rainwater and served as storage for odds and ends that didn't fit elsewhere. It was cramped, just over 3 feet high, and accessible only through a small door on the side of the house. The door had a lock, but we rarely used it. After all, who would bother with it in such a remote place? Brewster, our chocolate Labrador Weimaraner mix, was our first line of defense against the occasional bear or wolf that wandered too close to the house. He weighed nearly 60 kilos and had a deep, resonant bark that could send even the bravest intruder running. But that summer, Brewster started barking more often, every night without fail. At first, we thought it was just bears. Spring had turned to summer, and the bears were active again. But something about Brewster's bark felt different, more urgent, almost frantic. My parents shrugged it off as nothing unusual. I tried to convince myself they were right. One night, my best friend Kate came over for a sleepover. We stayed up late in the downstairs rec room, braiding each other's hair and giggling about boys from school. The room had large windows that faced a forest, their glass panes reflecting the dim light from inside like mirrors against the dark outside. We were mid-laugh when we both froze. There was a man's face in the window. For a moment, neither of us moved. The face was pressed close to the glass, shadowed by the darkness outside, but unmistakably human. His eyes seemed to bore into us, unblinking and intent. Kate screamed first. That broke my paralysis, and we bolted upstairs to my parents' room. My dad grabbed his rifle and stormed outside, while my mom called our neighbor for help. By the time they searched around the house with flashlights and Brewster at their side, there was no sign of anyone. "It's probably just some kid playing a prank," my dad said later as he locked all the doors and windows. But I couldn't shake the image of that face at the window. The barking continued in the weeks that followed. Every night, like clockwork, Brewster would growl low in his throat before letting out sharp barks that echoed through the stillness of the forest. My parents dismissed it as wildlife again, but I started to feel like something or someone was watching us. Then came the fire. It was late at night when I woke to the smell of smoke. At first, I thought I was dreaming until I heard my mom screaming, "Fire! Get up!" I stumbled out of bed into a hallway thick with smoke. My brother Travis's room was across from mine. He had Down syndrome and hated being woken up suddenly. I ran into his room and shook him awake while my parents yelled for us to get outside. The fire had started in the crawl space beneath our house, the same crawl space we never locked. Flames licked up through the floorboards of my parents' bedroom above it, while smoke poured into every corner of the house. We managed to escape with Brewster barking furiously beside us as neighbors rushed over to help douse the flames until firefighters arrived. It wasn't until hours later that we learned what caused it. Arson. Someone had deliberately set fire to our home using matches found near the crawlspace entrance. The investigation revealed something even more horrifying. Someone had been living in our crawlspace for months. Inside, they found cigarette butts and soda cans piled in one corner, a makeshift bed hidden behind one of the water tanks. There were holes drilled into some of the plywood walls. Holes that lined up perfectly with spots where we often changed clothes or hung out during sleepovers in the rec room downstairs. My stomach churned when I realized what this meant. Whoever had been living there had been watching us, watching me, for weeks, maybe longer. The police suspected Mark, a troubled boy who had visited our house once before under the pretense of being friends with Travis. My mom had always felt uneasy around him. Now she knew why. Mark's uncle was one of the firefighters who responded to our fire that night. He spotted Mark lurking near our driveway during all the chaos and immediately recognized him from my mom's description of what she'd seen weeks earlier when someone ran from our property after being spotted near Brewster's pen. But nothing ever came of it legally. There wasn't enough evidence to press charges. It took months to repair our home after that fire, and even longer for me to feel safe again. The knowledge that someone had been living so close to us without our knowing left scars deeper than any physical damage ever could. Even now, years later at 34 years old, I can't shake certain habits born from those events. Keeping every door locked at all times, double-checking windows before bed, sleeping with lights on if I'm alone in my house, and sometimes, late at night when everything is quiet, I think about those holes drilled into plywood walls and wonder how many secrets they still hold within their silent wood-grain whispers from long ago. And that's the end of story number 10. I highly request you to subscribe to Horror Vault channel to keep listening to our new upcoming vault of horror stories. I will see you in the next video.